Hello, Environmental Policy 2 students. We're back for week 6 on roles and types of environmental monitoring. Obviously, a lot of what your course classes have taught you is on monitoring issues, but there's the policy environment associated with that is a key aspect of most laws and regulations. Most laws and regulations within Canada and other OECD countries will require environmental monitoring by pollution-intensive industries to make sure that they're complying with their environmental standards. But there are different types of environmental monitoring. The first major type I want you to be aware of is self-monitoring of environmental performance, and that's typically what industries do on a consistent basis to ensure that they're not going out of line with environmental regulations on emissions or on performance requirements. And they will conduct ongoing monitoring of their own environmental performance, and they will keep records of that to ensure that in dialogue with regulators they can prove that they've been in environmental compliance on a consistent basis. So that's sort of self-monitoring environmental performance. And in pollution-intensive industries, that's usually a requirement of a regulation. So even though most responsible industries would do that in any case, to ensure that they're in compliance with environmental regulations, a lot of regulations, particularly in pollution-intensive industries, like in the chemical industry, will require that this be part of their operations anyway to be in compliance with the regulation, and those monitoring requirements will typically be coupled with reporting requirements, so that the industry has to report to government on a regular basis on its environmental performance. The next kind of monitoring I want to talk about is independent monitoring, carried out in two ways. One is systematic monitoring, and one is random monitoring. And those are typically carried out by government, those forms of monitoring, but can be in partnership with industry as well. Systematic monitoring is often also called ecosystem monitoring, but it's a form of monitoring where, quite apart from any particular business or any particular plant or facility, the government will conduct ambient monitoring just to determine how well and how healthy the environment is in a general area that has traditionally been under substantial stress. For example, the Government of Canada and Ontario and Quebec will consistently monitor, for example, the water quality in the Great Lakes, water quality in the Niagara River, water quality in the St. Clair River, and so on and so forth. And for example, you might have heard recent reports that came out, actually in the first week of this term, where they're finding in the Niagara River very, very high incidences of antidepressants in the water sources that are getting into the fish and the fish brains. That's discovered through systematic or broader ecosystem monitoring, just to determine that the state of the ecosystem environmental health period, but it tends to target high stress areas. The other part of this type of monitoring, which we call independent environmental monitoring, is that by independent we mean independent of an individual company. For example, it's not the company doing it but the government doing it, and that is random monitoring. And that random monitoring usually takes place as part of the enforcement regime for compliance, promotion, and enforcement of regulations. So periodically, a government will do a spot check of an industry or a company or a facility that has had a record of pollution in the past, and they will determine whether the findings that they're getting from the industry themselves are the same as their finding from an independent monitoring. And those are random sampling type exercises that governments will do to ensure that compliance, promotion, and enforcement is actually taking place. And these monitoring exercises I'm talking about can include all of the environmental media, of course. I mean, water and air are two of the obvious ones, but also land as well. There will be all kinds of monitoring in various environmental media. Now, in each of these cases, government regulations have a major play. role to play. I mean, they may require industry to do their own monitoring, but certainly the compliance promotion enforcement plans of governments, as well as the regulations, will require certain types of broad ambient monitoring or systemic monitoring and random monitoring. So it's important for you to understand the distinctions between these and the role they play in regulation and in compliance promotion and enforcement. Now, rarely does environmental monitoring ever work if it's not part of a systematic plan. For example, the Government of Canada, Environment Canada, Environment Climate Change Canada now will have a monitoring plan, and they'll have a specific way that they go about doing it and keeping the records and so on, because if it ever goes to a legal action or any kind of an enforcement action, all of these records have to be kept. But also, if you don't have a monitoring plan, whether you're a company or you're the government, the likelihood is things will fall through the cracks. So usually there's a very specific plan that goes into monitoring. And my lecture notes for this week, I cover off the items for that. But you can also identify some of those items in the readings for the week. Okay. Now, when you collect the monitoring data, I mean, collecting the monitoring data is only one aspect of monitoring. I mean, data is only useful as far as it's taken in analysis and providing useful decision-making information. So collecting the information and testing water quality, for example, is only relevant in context of a time series of water quality data that's been collected over time, and you're comparing against a baseline quality to determine whether you're getting better or you're getting worse. And there are various statistical techniques for doing that. We don't go into that detail in this class, but suffice it to say that monitoring is data collection, but there's the data analysis and what it implies for understanding where the sources of the problems are and what the exposure pathways are to surrounding populations, how they use the water source, how they catch the fish, and so on and so forth. All goes into analyzing monitoring data to determine risk and exposure pathways. And so monitoring itself, it looks like a technical exercise in the lab, but it becomes policy relevant once you begin to look at these things in a time series context, begin to look at causes and mitigation or prevention actions that need to be taken. So look through these notes and understand these different types of monitoring and how they play with compliance, promotion, and enforcement. And I think you'll have a good grasp of what's going on, because I know you've been getting a lot of this, the sampling and the other types of issues in your lab courses. Okay? So again, we'll see you next week for week 7. Bye-bye now.